The sun was dying behind the ragged hills when Clara May Ellison first set foot in Dustin Hollow. Her boots, once decent leather, now showed more dust than hide, and each step sent small clouds rising from the packed earth of Main Street. She'd been walking since dawn. Maybe longer time had a way of blurring when hunger gnawed at your ribs and thirst cracked your lips. The town wasn't much to look at. A general store with peeling paint, a saloon that leaked piano music and men's laughter, a church with a crooked steeple pointing accusingly at heaven, the kind of place that existed between somewhere and nowhere, collecting souls who'd lost their way or given up trying to find it. Clara paused at the water trough outside the blacksmith's shop. The smithy had gone home, his forge cold, but the water remained. She cupped her hands, drank deep, then splashed her face. The water was warm and tasted of iron, but it was wet, and that was enough. She straightened, pushed damp strands of brown hair from her forehead, and surveyed the street. A few folks still moved about in the fading light. A woman hurrying home with a basket covered in checkered cloth. An old man sitting on the general store porch, whittling something that might have been a whistle or might have been nothing at all. They glanced at her, then away. The way people do when they recognize trouble but want no part of it. Clara didn't blame them. She knew how she must look travel-worn dress that had once been blue, now faded to the color of winter sky. No hat, no gloves, no wedding band, though the pale circle on her finger told its own story. A woman alone was either running from something or towards something, and neither option invited friendly curiosity. She approached the old man first. His knife never stopped moving as she climbed the 2 steps to the porch. "Evening, sir," she said. Her voice came out rough, and she cleared her throat. "I'm looking for a place to stay the night. Nothing fancy, just somewhere with a roof." The old man's eyes, nested in wrinkles, studied her briefly. "Mrs. Hartley runs the boarding house, 2 doors past the church." He gestured with his knife. "But she's particular about payment up front." "I see." Clara's hand moved unconsciously to her pocket, feeling the few coins there. Not enough for a boarding house, particular or otherwise. "Is there anywhere else a barn? Maybe I can work for my keep." The whittling stopped. The old man looked at her more carefully now, taking in the straight set of her shoulders despite her obvious exhaustion, the way she met his gaze without begging or demanding. "Barn's full of horses," he said slowly, "and the church locks its doors at night, preacher's orders." He spat tobacco juice into a tin can. "Though there's Jonas Reed, lives out past the mill, big house for 1 man. Mike could use some help around the place." "Jonas Reed," Clara repeated. "He'd take in a stranger." The old man resumed his whittling. "Didn't say he would, said he might could use help. Man's been alone going on 3 years now. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's not unkind." Another stream of tobacco juice. "Just particular in different ways than Mrs. Hartley." Clara nodded. "Past the mill, you said?" "Follow the road till you see the water wheel. His place sits back in the cottonwoods. White house, green shutters. Can't miss it." The old man glanced at the darkening sky. "Better hurry. Jonas don't much care for visitors after dark." She thanked him and descended the steps. The road stretched before her, rutted and dusty. Her feet protested blisters had formed and burst and formed again during her journey, but she'd come this far on worse than sore feet. The mill wheel came into view as the last light faded. It stood still. No stream to turn it this late in the dry season. Beyond it, she could make out the cottonwoods, their leaves rustling with evening breeze. And there, set back from the road, the White House materialized from the gathering darkness. It was bigger than she'd expected. 2 stories, with a wraparound porch and those green shutters the old man had mentioned. But it had the look of a place where life had paused. No flowers in the window boxes, no curtains softening the glass, no welcoming light spilling from within. Just a house, solid and silent, waiting for something that might never come. Clara climbed the porch steps, They creaked under her weight, announcing her presence to anyone inside. She raised her hand to knock, hesitated. What was she doing? Asking a stranger, a man alone, for shelter. Every lesson of propriety she'd ever learned warned against it. But propriety was a luxury she could no longer afford. She knocked, 3 solid raps that echoed in the stillness. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time. Mr. Reed, Mr. Jonas Reed. I'm sorry to disturb you. I was told you might have need of help around your place. A light appeared in an upstairs window. Then footsteps, heavy and measured, descending stairs. The door remained closed, but a voice came through it, deep and wary. Who told you that? A gentleman at the general store. I didn't catch his name. He was whittling. That'd be Cornelius. A pause. It's late for visiting. Miss. It's Mrs., Clara corrected automatically, then wished she hadn't. Mrs. Ellison. And yes, I know it's late. I've been walking all day, and She stopped, reorganized her thoughts. I can cook, clean, mend, tend garden. I'm not asking for charity, just a place to lay my head in exchange for honest work. Silence stretched between them, the door still firmly shut. Clara could feel him on the other side, weighing her words, measuring the risk of letting a stranger into his careful solitude. You running from something, Mrs. Ellison? The question hit closer than he could know. Clara's jaw tightened. I'm running towards something, Mr. Reed, a new start, same as lots of folk out here. I'd imagine. Another pause, then the scrape of a bolt being drawn. The door opened halfway, revealing a tall man in shirt sleeves and suspenders. The lamplight behind him cast his face in shadow, but she could make out strong features. A day's worth of stubble, dark hair that needed cutting. Jonas Reed studied her with eyes that had seen their share of sorrow. She recognized the look. It was the one she saw in her own reflection when she bothered to seek one out. You eaten today? He asked finally. This morning. It might have been true. She honestly couldn't remember. He stepped back, opening the door wider. Kitchen's through there. There's stew on the stove, bread in the box. Help yourself. He moved to light another lamp. You can sleep upstairs. Second door on the right. Sheets are clean. Clara stepped inside, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the light. The front room was sparse but clean. A few pieces of furniture, a cold fireplace, a braided rug that had seen better days. It smelled of wood polish and emptiness. I haven't agreed to any arrangement, Jonas said, his back to her as he adjusted the lamp. Tonight's just tonight. We'll talk come morning about anything more. I understand. Clara moved toward the kitchen, then stopped. Thank you, Mr. Reed. Not many would open their door to a stranger. He turned to look at her then, and she saw his face clearly for the first time, younger than she'd expected, maybe 35 or 40, tired around the eyes, a small scar on his left cheek, white against sun-weathered skin. My wife used to say turning away someone in need was like turning away angels. His voice roughened on the words. Course, she said a lot of things. He didn't wait for a response, just picked up his lamp and headed for the stairs. I'll be in my study. You need anything, you can knock, but I'd appreciate if you didn't. Clara watched him climb the stairs, his broad shoulders rigid with the effort of maintaining distance. She understood. Kindness was harder when you'd been hurt. It required lowering defenses you'd spent months or years building. She found the kitchen and the promised stew. It was simple fare vegetables and what might have been rabbit, but it tasted like salvation. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, while taking in her surroundings. The kitchen was like the rest of the house, functional, clean, but lacking those small touches that made a place feel lived in. No flowers in a jar, no cheerful towels, no children's drawings tacked to walls. When she finished eating, she washed her bowl and spoon, dried them carefully, and put them back where she'd found them. Then she climbed the stairs, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The second door on the right opened to a small bedroom, a single bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand, a chair by the window. Moonlight streamed through thin curtains, painting everything in silver and shadow. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to feel the weight of the day, the week, the month that had brought her here. She'd started her journey with more money, more hope, more certainty about where she was going. Now all she had was a borrowed bed in a stranger's house and the possibility of tomorrow. She unlaced her boots but didn't remove them, stretched out on top of the quilt fully clothed. The bed was soft. The pillow smelled of lavender and dust. Through the thin walls, she could hear Jonas read moving in his study, the occasional creak of floorboards, the whisper of turning pages. "Please," she whispered to the darkness, to God if he was listening, to anyone who might care. "Just let me sleep. Just let me rest without dreams. That's all I ask." Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour. Clara closed her eyes and waited for morning to decide her fate. The knock came at dusk, 3 days after the first snow. Jonas had been mending harness leather by lamplight, his fingers working the all-through-tough hide, when he heard footsteps on his porch. He set down his tools slowly, deliberately, and listened. Light steps, hesitant, a woman's tread. He'd seen her in town earlier that day. This Clara Ellison, who'd spent 3 nights under his roof and 3 days working his kitchen garden like she was born to it. She'd been at the general store, counting coins in her palm, putting back a spool of thread when the sum came up short. Pride in the set of her jaw, defeat in the slope of her shoulders. Now she was back. The knock came again, firmer this time. Jonas stayed in his chair. Through the window, he could see her silhouette against the dying light. She'd wrapped herself in a worn shawl, and the wind played with the loose strands of her hair. "Mr. Reed," her voice carried through the door. "I know you're in there. I can see the lamp." Still, he didn't move. She'd left that morning as agreed. Her 3 nights of shelter ended. He'd given her bread for the road, even pressed $1 into her hand despite her protests. That should have been the end of it. "The boarding house is full," she continued. "Mrs. Hartley said she might have space next week, but—" A pause. He could picture her gathering her pride, forcing out the words. "It's going to snow tonight. You can smell it in the air." Jonas had smelled it too, the sharp, metallic scent that preceded a good storm. He'd already brought in extra wood, checked the shutters, prepared for a long, cold night, alone as it should be. "I'm not asking for charity." Clara said, "I've been thinking, you need help here. Whether you admit it or not, that garden's only half turned for winter. Your fence has gaps a child could walk through. And when's the last time those windows upstairs saw a proper cleaning?" Jonas's jaw tightened. The house was fine as it was. He'd kept it standing, kept it functional. What more did it need? "I could stay on," she continued. "Not just nights, but proper-like, as a housekeeper, room and board and maybe a small wage. If you can manage it. It'd be respectable, business-like." The word respectable almost made him laugh. Nothing about this situation was respectable. A widow and a widower. Sharing a house the town gossips would have a field day. But then again, when had he last cared what the town thought? He heard her shift on the porch, heard the first fat snowflakes hitting the roof. In another minute, she'd leave, walk back to town in the gathering storm. Too proud to beg further. And that would be that. Jonas stood abruptly, the chair scraping against floorboards. 3 strides took him to the door. He didn't open it. Not yet. "You know what people will say," he said through the wood. "People always have something to say." Her voice was steady. "I've learned to let them tire themselves out with talking. I'm not easy to work for. I like things particular ways." "I've noticed. Your coffee pot always sits 2 inches from the stove edge. Your boots face north by the door. You fold your newspaper in exact quarters. A pause. I can learn your ways. Jonas's hand moved to the bolt. Stopped. 3 years he'd kept this door closed to all but the most necessary visitors. 3 years of careful solitude, of not having to explain or accommodate or remember what it was like to share space with another person. I don't make conversation, he warned. I take my meals alone. I don't want to hear about your past or your plans or whatever brought you to Dustin Hollow. That suits me fine. And you'll sleep upstairs, like before. That door stays closed at night, no exceptions. Of course. The snow was falling harder now. He could hear it hissing against the lamp-lit windows. Jonas drew the bolt and opened the door just wide enough to see her face. Snowflakes had caught in her hair, on her shoulders. Her lips were already blue with cold. You'll work sunrise to sunset, he said. Sabbath is your own. $1 a week plus room and board. You want supplies for the house? You ask first. You want time for yourself? You ask first. You bring no visitors here, ever. Clara met his gaze steadily. Agreed. He stepped back, opening the door wider. She entered quickly, quietly, bringing the cold and snow with her. Jonas shut the door and threw the bolt home while she shook snow from her shawl. Same room as before, he said without looking at her. You know where the linens are. Yes. She started toward the stairs, then paused. Mr. Reed, thank you. Don't thank me yet. Like I said, I'm not easy to work for. He returned to his chair and his harness mending. And Mrs. Ellison, that door upstairs, it stays closed. You already said that. It bears repeating. She climbed the stairs without another word. Jonas took up his awl again, but his hands had lost their rhythm. He could hear her moving about overhead, quiet as she tried to be. The house had been silent for so long. He'd forgotten how sound carried through the boards. He worked until the lamp burned low, then banked the fire and made his way to his own room, past her door without pausing, though he noticed the thin line of light beneath it. She was awake, probably wondering what she'd gotten herself into. Well, that made 2 of them. Jonas lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the snow pile against the windows. The house felt different with her in it. Fuller, somehow, heavier with unspoken questions and careful distances. He turned on his side, faced the wall where Sarah's photograph once hung. He'd taken it down the day after the funeral, unable to bear her frozen smile, the promise in her eyes that life had failed to keep. The nail hole remained, a small wound in the plaster he'd never bothered to patch. Somewhere in the darkness, a floorboard creaked, then silence. Clara learning already to move through his house like a ghost, taking up as little space as possible. He understood the impulse. He'd been doing the same thing for 3 years, haunting his own life. Jonas closed his eyes and willed himself towards sleep. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. A stranger in his kitchen, a woman's presence in his ordered world, questions from town, looks from neighbors, the careful dance of 2 damaged people trying not to step on each other's wounds. But tonight, at least, the door was bolted, the snow was falling, and Clara May Ellison was sleeping safe under his roof, even if neither of them could say exactly why that mattered. The lamp in her room stayed lit for a long time. Jonas knew because he was awake to see its glow fade as the oil ran low. Only then, in the perfect darkness of a winter storm, did he finally allow his guard to drop enough for sleep to claim him. His last thought was of the harness on his workbench, half mended. Tomorrow he'd finish it. Tomorrow he'd return to his routines, his silence, his carefully maintained distances. A housekeeper was all she was, a business arrangement, nothing more. But even as he told himself this, he knew the truth. He'd opened his door. After 3 years of keeping it locked against the world, he'd drawn the bolt and let her in. And no amount of rules or warnings or closed bedroom doors could undo that simple, dangerous fact. The snow continued to fall. blanketing the house in white silence. And two people who'd sworn off hoping for anything beyond survival lay awake in their separate rooms, listening to the storm and pretending they weren't both afraid of what morning might bring. Sleep wouldn't come. Clara lay rigid on the narrow bed, still wearing her dress and boots, listening to every sound the old house made. The wind rattled the shutters. Snow whispered against glass. Somewhere in the walls, mice scurried on secret errands. She'd slept in worse places these past weeks. Barn lofts that smelled of hay and manure. Under bridges with her back against cold stone. Once, memorably, in a church porch until the sexton chased her off at dawn. But those places hadn't required anything of her except endurance. This house, this room, this arrangement, it all felt like standing on ice, waiting for the crack that would send her plunging into dark water. Jonas Reed moved in his room down the hall. She could track him by the creaking floorboards, bed to window, window to door, door back to bed. He couldn't sleep either. The thought should have frightened her, a wakeful man, a woman alone, all the ways this could go wrong. But strangely, it didn't. His restlessness felt like her own, born of uncertainty rather than intention. Clara turned onto her side, facing the wall. Her body ached from the days walking, the weeks wandering, the months running. She needed sleep desperately, but her mind wouldn't quiet. "Please, let me sleep," she whispered into the pillow. The words had become a prayer, a plea, a habit born of too many wakeful nights. "Just let me rest." A board creaked in the hallway. Footsteps, careful and deliberate. They paused outside her door. Clara's breath caught. Her hand moved instinctively to her boots, ready to run if needed. But the footsteps continued past, down the stairs. She heard the front room door open and close. Then, faintly, the scrape of a chair being repositioned, the pop of wood being added to the fire. Clara sat up slowly. Through her window, she could see snow still falling, thick and silent. The room was cold enough that her breath misted in the air. She'd noticed earlier there was no stove upstairs, no provision for heat except what rose from below. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, wincing as her feet hit the floor. Her boots were still damp from the day's travels, but she couldn't bring herself to remove them. They were her only good pair, and sleeping in them ensured they'd be on her feet if she needed to leave quickly, quietly as she could manage. Clara eased her door open and peered into the hallway, dark except for a faint glow from downstairs. She crept to the top of the steps, listened. The sound of wood settling in the fireplace, the whisper of pages turning. He was reading by firelight, or pretending to. She should go back to bed, lock her door, maintain the boundaries he'd so clearly established. But the cold was seeping through her dress, and the promise of warmth drew her like a moth to flame. Clara descended the stairs, testing each step for creaks. At the bottom, she could see into the front room. Jonas sat in a wing-back chair pulled close to the hearth, a book open on his lap. He'd changed from his work clothes into a nightshirt and trousers, thrown a blanket around his shoulders. The firelight carved shadows into his face, making him look older, or maybe just more honestly tired. He spoke without looking up. "Can't sleep." Clara jumped, her hand flying to her throat. "I didn't mean to disturb." "You didn't." He turned a page. "Cold upstairs. Always is when winter sets in proper. There's extra blankets in the cedar chest." "Thank you." She hesitated in the doorway. "You can't sleep either." "Rarely do." Another page turned. "You'll find it's a quiet house at night, sometimes too quiet." Clara understood. Silence could be louder than noise when you were used to another person's breathing, another heart beating beside yours in the dark. She'd spent months learning to sleep alone, and still hadn't mastered it. "I could make coffee," she offered. "Or tea, if you have it." "No need." He finally looked up from his book. In the firelight, his eyes were darker than she'd noticed before. But you can sit, if you like. Chair's comfortable enough." She moved into the room, chose the chair across from his. The heat from the fire was blessed relief. She tucked her feet under her skirts, trying to hide the fact that she still wore her boots. Jonas noticed anyway. His gaze lingered on the muddy leather peeking from beneath her hem. "Planning on running?" "Habit," Clara said simply. He nodded and returned to his book. They sat in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The fire crackled. Snow tapped at windows. The house settled around them like an old dog finding its position for the night. "What are you reading?" Clara asked eventually. Jonas held up the cover. "Livestock Management in the Western Territories. Thrilling stuff." Despite herself, Clara smiled. "Sounds it. Helps with the sleeplessness. Usually. Tonight's not cooperating." He closed the book, set it aside. "You'll learn this house has moods. Winter makes it restless. Houses can't be restless. This one can." He stared into the fire. "Built it myself, mostly. Every board and nail. Thought I was building something permanent. Turns out nothing is." Clara pulled the chair's blanket tighter around herself. "When did she pass your wife?" Jonas's jaw tightened. "Thought we agreed not to talk about the past." "We did. Sorry." But he answered anyway, after a long pause. 3 years come January. Pneumonia took her, and the baby she was carrying." "I'm sorry," Clara said again, because what else was there to say? "Don't be. Sorry doesn't bring anyone back." He stood abruptly. "I'm going to bank this fire. You should get some sleep. Tomorrow's a full day." Clara rose as well. "Mr. Reed, about the lamp in my room." He paused in the act of adjusting the fire screen. "What about it? Would it be all right if I kept it burning low? I can replace the oil from my wages." Jonas straightened slowly, in the dying firelight. She couldn't read his expression. Afraid of the dark. Afraid of the dreams. Something in his face shifted. Recognition. Maybe, or understanding. "Keep it as low as you can. Oil's not cheap." "Thank you." He finished with the fire and moved toward the stairs. "I'll be up at first light. I expect breakfast by 6. "It'll be ready." They climbed the stairs together, but separated at the top without words. Clara returned to her cold room, but it felt less hostile now. She adjusted the lamp's wick until it gave off the barest glow, just enough to hold the absolute darkness at bay. Through the wall, she heard Jonas settling into his own bed. The house grew quiet except for the storm outside. Clara removed her boots finally, placed them carefully beside the bed, pointing toward the door. Then she lay down fully dressed and pulled every blanket she could find over herself. "Please, let me sleep," she whispered again. But this time it felt less like begging and more like stating an intention. The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Clara watched them move, her eyes growing heavy. Somewhere in the house. A clock chimed midnight, then 1, then 2. She must have dozed, because suddenly she was aware of movement in the hallway again. Quiet footsteps pausing outside her door. Her body tensed, but she kept her breathing steady, feigning sleep. "No one's going to hurt you here." Jonas's voice came through the door, so quiet she almost thought she'd imagined it. "Lock it if you need to, but no one's going to hurt you." The footsteps retreated. A door closed softly. Clara lay still for a long moment, then rose and turned the key in the lock. Not because she feared him, but because the sound of it, that solid click, felt like drawing a line. This side was hers. That side was his. Clear boundaries in a situation that could too easily blur. She returned to bed and surprised herself by falling into sleep almost immediately. The lamp burned low through the night, its small flame a promise that darkness wasn't absolute. That morning would come, that some things could be depended upon even when everything else had failed. In his room, Jonas heard the lock turn and nodded to himself. Good. She was careful, smart. She'd need both qualities to survive in his house, in his carefully ordered world. He'd meant what he said. No one would hurt her here. He'd make sure of that, even if it meant fighting his own impulses toward kindness, because kindness could be its own kind of hurt when you weren't ready for it. The snow stopped just before dawn. Jonas was awake to see it, staring out his window at the white-wrapped world. Somewhere below, he heard movement in the kitchen, the clatter of the stove being stoked, the whistle of a kettle. She was up, making breakfast as promised, beginning the strange dance of two strangers sharing space, sharing silence, sharing nothing more than they absolutely had to. It would have to be enough. For both of them. Dawn came pale and cold. The world transformed by a foot of fresh snow. Clara stood at the kitchen window, watching the sun struggle through heavy clouds. She'd been up since 4, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, driven by the need to prove herself useful on this first real day of their arrangement. The coffee was already percolating, filling the kitchen with its bitter comfort. Biscuits waited in the oven, golden and fragrant. She'd found bacon in the cold cellar, eggs in the henhouse out back. Simple fare. But she'd learned that men who lived alone rarely expected more than substance. Jonas appeared at exactly 6 o'clock, washed and dressed for the day's work. He paused in the doorway, taking in the set table, the steaming plates, the kitchen already warm and welcoming. "You found everything," he said, not a question. "Yes." Clara poured coffee into his cup, noted how he took it black, filed the information away. The hens weren't happy about being disturbed, but they cooperated eventually. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "They're particular about strangers. Belong to my—" He stopped. "They're old birds, set in their ways." Clara placed a plate before him. 4 eggs, bacon, 2 biscuits, no butter. She'd noticed yesterday he pushed butter away when offered. Small things, but she was good at noticing. Had to be. She moved to take her own plate to the small table by the window, but Jonas spoke. "Snow's going to be trouble today." Clara paused. "Oh. Too wet for December. It'll freeze tonight, make ice underneath. Roads will be treacherous for a week at least." He cut into his eggs with precise movements. "Means no supplies from town. No way to send you back if this arrangement doesn't work out." "I see." She sat at her small table, understanding the warning beneath his words. They were trapped together now, for better or worse. They ate in silence. Jonas methodical and focused. Clara picking at her food despite her hunger. The kitchen felt too small with both of them in it. Too intimate, despite the careful distance they maintained. When he finished, Jonas pushed back from the table. "I'll be in the barn most of the morning. Horses need tending, and that roof's got a weak spot I've been meaning to patch. You know your duties." "Yes, cleaning, mending, preparing meals. I thought I might start with the upstairs windows, like I mentioned." "Leave my room be." "Of course." He collected his coat and hat from the hooks by the door. "There's a list of suppliers in the drawer by the stove. When the road's clear, you can make an account in my name. Be sensible about it." "I will." Jonas paused at the door. Looking back, morning light caught his profile, softening the hard edges. "That coffee's good, better than I make." Before Clara could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone with the dishes and the strange warmth of an unexpected compliment. She cleaned the kitchen thoroughly, learning its secrets, where the good knives were kept, which drawer stuck, how the pump handle needed an extra lift to catch properly. Then she climbed the stairs to tackle the promised windows. The hallway was dim despite the morning light. 3 doors besides her own Jonas's room at the far end, firmly closed, a narrow closet full of linens, and another room she hadn't noticed before. This door stood slightly ajar. Clara knew she shouldn't look, but curiosity had always been her weakness, and the house held too many silences not to wonder about them. She pushed the door wider. A nursery, or what would have been one. A wooden cradle sat by the window, dust motes dancing above its empty basin, tiny clothes folded on a dresser, a rocking chair with a quilt draped over its back, as if someone had just stepped away and might return any moment. Clara's throat tightened. She backed out of the room, pulled the door firmly shut. Some griefs were too private to witness, even accidentally. She threw herself into cleaning the other windows, scrubbing years of grime from the glass until her arms ached. From her vantage point, she could see Jonas working on the barn roof, sure-footed despite the snow. He moved with economy, no wasted motion, fixing what needed fixing without fuss or complaint. By noon, Clara had windows gleaming and soup simmering on the stove. She was considering whether to call Jonas for lunch or wait for him to come in on his own when she heard voices approaching the house. Through the clean window, she saw Jonas talking with another man near the barn. The stranger was older, bearded, gesturing emphatically. Jonas stood with arms crossed, shaking his head at whatever was being proposed. The conversation grew heated. The stranger's voice carried across the snow. "Damn foolishness, taking in some wandering woman. You know what people are saying." Jonas's response was too low to hear, but his posture spoke volumes. Closed off, defensive, done with the conversation. The stranger threw up his hands and stomped away, throwing one last comment over his shoulder. "Your Sarah would be spinning in her grave." Jonas stood perfectly still for a long moment after the man left. Then he turned and saw Clara watching from the window. Their eyes met across the snowy yard. She expected anger at her eavesdropping, but his expression held something else. Resignation. Maybe, or just tiredness. He came in for lunch without comment, ate his soup in silence. Clara didn't ask about the visitor. She'd learned long ago that men talked when they were ready, not when you wanted them to. Instead, she served the meal and returned to her work, found his mending basket, full of shirts with torn seams and missing buttons, settled by the kitchen fire to fix what could be fixed, make useful what had been neglected. The afternoon passed quietly. Jonas returned to his barn work. Clara moved through the house like she belonged there, setting things to rights. She found a cake of lye soap and scrubbed the kitchen floor, beat the parlor rug in the side yard, clouds of dust rising like smoke, small acts of reclamation. As evening approached, she started dinner, found a tough piece of beef that would benefit from slow cooking, vegetables that had seen better days but would do well in a stew. She was peeling potatoes when Jonas appeared in the doorway. "Smells good," he said. "It'll be ready in an hour." She focused on her knife work. "Your shirts are mended. I left them on your bed." "You didn't need to." He stopped. "Thank you." Clara risked a glance at him. He looked tired. Snow in his hair. Exhaustion in the line of his shoulders. Hard day. Roofs fixed. That's what matters. He moved to the stove, poured himself coffee. That was Tom Morrison earlier, owns the place next to mine, likes to share his opinions. Most neighbors do. He said I should send you on your way. Said it wasn't proper, a woman like you in my house. Clara's hand stilled on the potato. A woman like me? A woman alone, no references, no connections. Jonas stared into his coffee cup. He's not wrong. People will talk. They always do. Clara resumed peeling. Steady strokes. Question is whether you care what they say. Jonas was quiet for a long moment. Then, my Sarah used to say reputation was just fear dressed up in Sunday clothes. Never did understand what she meant. Sounds like she was wise. She was... He set down his cup. I'll wash up for dinner. He left, and Clara continued her work. But something had shifted in the kitchen, in the space between them. Not friendship, not yet, but an acknowledgement, maybe, that they were both here by choice, both staying despite the talk, despite the complications. Outside, the sun was setting, turning the snow pink and gold. Clara lit the lamps against the growing darkness. Set the table for 2. Then thought better of it. Set one place at the main table, one at the small table by the window. Boundaries maintained. When Jonas returned, he looked at the 2 settings and nodded. Understood. They ate separately but together. The only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls, the pop of wood in the stove, the wind picking up outside. After dinner, Jonas helped clear the table without being asked. They worked in companionable silence, finding a rhythm. He washed, she dried. He put away plates. She wiped down surfaces. "I'll bank the fire," he said when they finished. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow's laundry day, if the weather holds." "All right." Clara hung the dish towel carefully. "Mr. Reed, about what your neighbors said. Doesn't matter what Tom Morrison says." Jonas's voice was firm. "You're here to work. I need the help. That's the end of it." Clara nodded, started toward the stairs, then turned back. "The lamp." "Keep it low," he said, already turning away. "Oil's not cheap." She climbed to her room, prepared for bed. The house felt different tonight, still careful, still quiet, but less strange. She could hear Jonas moving below, the routine sounds of a house settling for the night. Clara kept the lamp burning low, just as he'd said. Lay down fully dressed again, but with her boots beside the bed this time. Not on her feet. Progress of a sort. "Please, let me sleep," she whispered to the darkness beyond the lamp's small circle. And whether from exhaustion or the strange comfort of knowing she wasn't entirely alone, sleep came easier. Not peaceful, not yet, but easier. Below, Jonas made his own preparations for night. Checked the locks, banked the fires, climbed the stairs to his cold room, paused outside the nursery door, as he did every night, but didn't enter. Some rooms stayed closed for good reason. He noticed the light under Clara's door, heard the rustle of bedclothes as she settled. Strange to have those sounds in his house again. Strange, but not unwelcome, though he'd never admit it aloud. Jonas entered his room, closed the door firmly. Through the wall, he could hear Clara's breathing already evening into sleep. He'd forgotten how a house felt with 2 heartbeats instead of 1. Fuller, more alive, more dangerous too, but that was a risk he'd already accepted when he'd let her stay. The wind rose outside, rattling the windows Clara had cleaned to crystal clarity. Tomorrow there would be laundry and meals and all the small negotiations of shared space. But tonight, at least, they'd found a balance. It wasn't much, but it was enough to build on. 3 days passed in careful routine. Clara learned Jonas's rhythm's coffee before dawn, breakfast at 6 sharp, dinner when the sun touched the western hills. He learned hers too, though he'd never admit to watching. The way she hummed while kneading bread, too soft to make out the tune. How she touched each doorframe as she passed, like marking her path through the house. On the 4th morning, Clara found him in the barn, fitting a new shoe to his mare's hoof. She'd brought coffee, strong and black the way he liked it. "Thought you might want this," she said, setting the cup on a hay bale within reach. Jonas glanced up, sweat beading despite the cold. Appreciated. She should have left then, returned to the house and the pile of mending waiting by the fire. Instead, she lingered, watching him work. His hands were gentle with the horse, patient when she shifted nervously. "What's her name?" Clara asked. "Buttercup." Color rose in Jonas's cheeks. "Sarah named her. Said a horse that color deserved a pretty name." "It suits her." Jonas finished with the shoe, ran his hand along the mare's flank. "She's getting old. Probably should have sold her last year, got something younger." "But you didn't." "No." He straightened, reaching for the coffee. "Some things you keep even when sense says otherwise." They stood in comfortable silence, barn cats weaving between their legs. Through the open doors, Clara could see the house, smoke rising from the chimney she'd cleaned yesterday. It looked lived in now, cared for in small ways that accumulated into something larger. "I need supplies," she said eventually. "The roads look clear enough. I could walk to town." "No." The word came sharp. Jonas softened his tone. "I mean, I'll take the wagon. Make me a list." "I could come with you. Help with the loading." His jaw tightened. "Better if you don't. Tom Morrison's been talking. Others, too. No need to give them more ammunition." Clara nodded, understanding. A woman could keep house for a man without scandal, barely. But riding to town together, that would set tongues wagging for sure. "I'll make the list," she said. Back in the kitchen, she wrote out what they needed. Flour, salt, coffee, lamp oil. She hesitated, then added thread and needles. The mending pile was growing, and Jonas's clothes were more holes than fabric in places. She was adding wood to the stove when she noticed the package on the table, brown paper, tied with string. Her name written across it in Jonas's careful hand. Inside, a wool shawl. Not new, she could see where it had been mended, but thick and warm, and far better than the threadbare one she'd been wearing. Clara lifted it to her face, breathed in the faint scent of lavender and cedar. She found Jonas harnessing the horses to the wagon. "Mr. Reed." It was Sarah's. He didn't look at her, focused on buckles and straps. "Been sitting in a trunk 3 years. Waste to let moths have it." "I can't accept this. Can't have my housekeeper freezing." He climbed onto the wagon seat. "Bad for my reputation." Before Clara could respond, he clicked to the horses and rolled away. She stood in the yard, clutching the shawl, watching until the wagon disappeared around the bend. The house felt different without him. Larger, emptier, full of spaces she hadn't yet explored. Clara wrapped the shawl around her shoulders. It smelled like memory and loss and returned inside. She threw herself into work, scrubbed the kitchen floor until it gleamed, cleaned out the pantry, organizing what little remained, found a basket of apples in the cellar, going soft but salvageable. She could make pie, maybe. Did Jonas like pie? She realized how little she knew about him beyond his careful routines. While searching for cinnamon, Clara discovered a wooden box shoved behind preserving jars. Inside, letters tied with ribbon, a woman's handwriting, addressed to "My dearest Jonas." She closed the box quickly, returned it to its hiding place. Some privacies were meant to be kept. The afternoon stretched long. Clara mended shirts by the window, watching the road for the wagon's return. She'd lived alone for months now. Thought she'd grown used to solitude, but waiting for someone to come home was different from having no one to wait for. When Jonas finally returned near sunset, Clara was at the door before he'd set the brake. He raised an eyebrow at her eagerness. "Everything all right?" he asked, climbing down. "Fine. Yes, just it's very quiet here." Something softened in his expression. "It is that." They unloaded supplies together, working in tandem. Jonas had bought everything on her list and more a small sack of sugar she hadn't dared request, a bar of fine soap that smelled like roses, 2 lamp wicks when she'd asked for one. "The soap is for you," he said gruffly when she protested. "Lies hard on hands." In the kitchen, putting things away, Jonas cleared his throat. "Ran into Mrs. Hartley at the Mercantile. She asked after you." Clara's hand stilled. "Oh." "Said to tell you the boarding house has a room available, if you're interested." The kitchen suddenly felt too warm. Clara busied herself with the coffee grinder. "Are you withdrawing your offer of employment?" "No." He paused. "Just thought you should know your options." "I know my options." She poured beans into the grinder, began turning the handle with perhaps more force than necessary. "Unless my work is unsatisfactory." "Your work is fine." "Then I'll stay." Jonas nodded once and retreated to the parlor. Clara heard him settling into his chair, the rustle of his evening paper, routine resuming. But something had shifted between them. an acknowledgement that this arrangement was becoming something more than temporary necessity. She made dinner the apple pie alongside ham and potatoes and set their separate tables. When she placed his plate before him, Jonas stared at the pie slice. "Haven't had pie in 3 years," he said quietly. "Is it should I not have?" "It's good." He took a bite, chewed slowly. "Sarah used to make apple pie every Sunday. Said the Sabbath deserved something sweet." Clara returned to her own table, her throat tight. Every kindness in this house came weighted with memory, every gesture compared to what had been before. They ate in silence, but Jonas cleaned his plate, pie included. When Clara rose to clear the dishes, he spoke. "Thank you. It's just pie." "No." He met her eyes. "It's not." Later, after dishes were done and the fire banked, Clara climbed to her room. On her pillow lay another package, smaller than the morning's. Inside, a white handkerchief, embroidered with tiny blue flowers. Her initials CME stitched in one corner. Clara sank onto the bed, tracing the letters with one finger. When had he noticed her initials? When had he cared enough to remember? Through the wall, she heard Jonas preparing for bed, the now familiar sounds of his nighttime routine. She thought about calling out, thanking him for the handkerchief, but words felt inadequate. Instead, she prepared for bed, folding the new shawl carefully over the chair. The handkerchief she placed beneath her pillow. Small tokens, but they changed the shape of her presence here. She was no longer just passing through, marking time until something better came along. She was becoming part of the household, part of the careful life Jonas had built around his grief. "Please, let me sleep," Clara whispered to the low-burning lamp. And for the first time since arriving at Jonas Reed's house, the words felt less like desperation and more like simple hope. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, town gossips, painful memories, the delicate navigation of two wounded people sharing space. But tonight she had a warm shawl, an embroidered handkerchief, and the knowledge that someone had thought of her comfort. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had in a very long time. Down the hall, Jonas lay awake despite his exhaustion. He'd seen Clara's face when she found the shawl, the way her fingers had traced the embroidered initials on the handkerchief. Small gestures, but they felt monumental after 3 years of giving nothing to anyone. The house creaked and settled around him. But underneath the familiar sounds was something new, the soft breathing of another person, the subtle presence that made the darkness less absolute. He'd forgotten how a house could hold more than one life, how spaces could expand to accommodate unexpected guests. The lamp still glowed beneath Clara's door. He'd stopped begrudging the oil days ago. Some comforts were worth more than their cost, and if a small flame helped her rest easier, so be it. God knew they both had shadows that needed holding at bay. Jonas closed his eyes, listened to the wind rattling the windows Clara had cleaned to sparkle. Tomorrow he'd need to check the henhouse roof, mend the paddock gate, dozen other tasks that kept a farm running. But he found himself thinking about pie instead, about the simple pleasure of something sweet on a weekday, about how one small change could make everything feel different. Not healing, not yet, but maybe the first step toward it, or at least toward something other than mere endurance. The clock downstairs chimed midnight. In her room, Clara's breathing had evened into sleep. Jonas let the sound wash over him, a lullaby he'd forgotten he missed. The house held them both, keeper and kept, neither quite sure anymore which role belonged to whom. Market day came with clear skies and cold wind. Clara stood at the kitchen window, watching Jonas load the wagon with goods to trade eggs from the henhouse, preserves she'd made from the cellar apples, a few pieces of furniture he'd repaired over the winter months. "I could help," she said, as she'd said every market day for the past 3 weeks. "Best you don't," Jonas replied, as he always did. But this time he added, "Maybe next month, when the talk dies down some." It was more than he'd offered before. Clara nodded and handed him the lunch she'd packed. Fresh bread, cheese, dried apple slices. He took it without comment, but she caught him almost smiling. After he left, Clara attacked the washing. Sheets and shirts flapped on the line like white flags of surrender. She was hanging Jonas's work pants when she heard horses approaching. 3 women from town stood at the gate. Clara recognized Mrs. Hartley from the boarding house, flanked by 2 others whose names she didn't know but whose expressions she could read well enough. Judgment dressed in Sunday bonnets. Mrs. Ellison, Mrs. Hartley called. "Might we have a word?" Clara's hands tightened on the wet fabric. "Of course. Would you like some tea?" "We won't be staying long." They didn't wait for invitation, pushing through the gate like they owned the place. Clara stood her ground by the washing line, forcing them to come to her. "We've come about your situation," Mrs. Hartley began. "It's causing concern in town." "My situation?" "Living here with Mr. Reed, unchaperoned." The woman to Mrs. Hartley's left thin as a rail with eyes like chips of ice practically hissed the last word. "I'm his housekeeper," Clara said evenly. "Nothing improper about honest work." "Nothing proper about it either." The third woman chimed in, younger than the others, with the satisfied look of someone who'd never faced a hard choice. A decent woman would find other arrangements. Clara hung the pants with careful precision. "A decent woman pays her own way." "There are other ways," Mrs. Hartley said. "The church needs help with cleaning, room and board in exchange for services, respectable work with godly people. And Mr. Reed is godly enough for me." The thin woman gasped. "Jonas Reed hasn't darkened a church door since his wife passed. Hardly a Christian example." Something hot flared in Clara's chest. Grief takes people different ways. Doesn't make them less worthy of kindness. "Is that what you're offering?" the younger woman asked, voice syrup-sweet with implication. "Kindness." Clara turned to face them fully. These women with their clean hands and full bellies, their husbands and homes and certainty about right and wrong. They knew nothing about the choices necessity forced on a person. "I'm offering housekeeping services in exchange for fair wages and shelter. Same as any domestic servant in any respectable home, if you see impropriety in that. Perhaps the fault lies in your vision, not my actions." "Mrs. Hartley's face flushed. "You forget yourself. Mrs. Ellison, we're trying to help you." "Are you—" Clara picked up another shirt, shook it sharp. "Or are you trying to help yourselves to gossip fodder? Because from where I stand, you're 3 married women spending your morning concerning yourselves with matters that don't affect you. The moral standing of our community affects us all," the thin woman said. "Then perhaps you should examine your own moral standing. When's the last time any of you offered Jonas Reed a kind word, a meal, simple neighborly compassion?" Clara's voice stayed level, but her hands trembled. 3 years that man's grieved alone, no one crossing his threshold with comfort or care. But let a woman try to earn honest wages in his house, and suddenly you're all concerned about his soul. The younger woman opened her mouth, but Mrs. Hartley silenced her with a gesture. "We've said our piece. The offer stands. The church needs cleaning, and we'd welcome your help. But if you choose to remain here, don't expect invitations to tea or inclusion in our sewing circle." "I never expected either." Clara returned to her washing. "Good day, ladies." They left in a rustle of offended dignity. Clara's hands shook as she hung the remaining clothes. She'd made enemies today, burned bridges she might need later. But the thought of Jonas returning to find her gone. No explanation, just another abandonment. No, she'd given her word. More than that, she'd found something here she hadn't expected. Not love or romance or any of the things those women imagined. Just quiet companionship with someone who understood that sometimes existing was achievement enough. Clara finished the washing and retreated inside. Her reflection caught in the hall mirror face flushed, hair escaping its pins, She looked like what they thought she was, probably. A desperate woman clinging to whatever shelter she could find. But they were wrong about the desperation. That had faded somewhere between the first week and the third, replaced by something steadier. Purpose. Maybe, or just the simple satisfaction of being needed. She spent the afternoon on a project she'd been planning, new curtains for the kitchen. Nothing fancy, just cheerful yellow fabric she'd bought with her own wages. The old ones were practically dust, falling apart at the first wash, as she sewed. Clara found herself humming, stopped when she realized it, then started again. The house could use some music, even her poor attempts at it. Jonas returned as the sun was setting, wagon lighter but wearing a satisfied expression that meant good trades. Clara met him at the door, took his coat. How was the market? Fair enough. Sold all the preserves. Mrs. Abernathy says to tell you she'll take as many as you can make. That's good news. Clara hesitated. You had visitors while you were gone. Jonas's face shuddered. Tom Morrison again. Mrs. Hartley, with friends. Clara busied herself at the stove. They came to save my reputation. Offered me work at the church instead. I see. Jonas sat heavily in his chair. And I told them I already had work. Clara? It was the first time he'd used her given name. They both noticed. Both chose to let it pass. I know what people are saying. Clara continued. I know what it looks like. But I also know I've got a roof over my head. Honest wages. And an employer who treats me with respect. That's more than I had before. And more than they offered. Jonas was quiet for a long moment. It's not fair to you. The talk. Life's not fair. We both know that. Clara set his dinner before him. Besides, their opinions don't keep me warm at night. She retreated to her own table before he could respond. They ate in their usual quiet, but the silence felt different, weighted with unspoken understanding. After dinner, Jonas didn't immediately retreat to his chair. Instead, he stood by the window, looking out at the darkening sky. They're not wrong, you know, the townswomen. This arrangement, it compromises you. Clara continued washing dishes. I was compromised long before I knocked on your door. That's different. Is it? She turned to face him. A woman alone is always compromised in some way. Too young, too old, too poor, too proud. There's no winning that game, so I've stopped playing. Jonas turned from the window. In the lamplight, she could see the conflict in his face. A good man trying to do right in a situation with no clear answers. If you need to go. I don't. Clara dried her hands carefully. Unless you're asking me to leave. No. The word came quick, surprising them both. No, I'm not asking that. They stood looking at each other across the kitchen. Something unspoken hummed in the air between them, fragile as spun glass. Clara broke the moment first, turning back to her dishes. Then that's settled. Let them talk. Eventually they'll tire of it and move on to fresher scandal. Jonas moved toward the stairs, paused. Clara, thank you for staying. She nodded, not trusting her voice. He climbed the stairs, and she heard his door close. Only then did she notice the package he'd left on the table. Inside, a length of deep blue fabric, far finer than anything she'd buy for herself. A note in his careful hand. Thought this might make nice curtains for the parlor. J. Clara held the fabric to the light. It was beautiful, impractical, absolutely perfect. She pressed it to her cheek, allowed herself one moment of pure, uncomplicated happiness. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more whispers, more judgment, more careful navigation of the boundaries they'd established. But tonight she had blue fabric and yellow curtains and the knowledge that someone wanted her to stay. She banked the fire and climbed the stairs, paused outside the closed nursery door, as she sometimes did, wondered if Jonas ever opened it, if dust still dancing over empty furniture, waiting for lives that would never fill it. In her room, Clara lit the lamp low as always. But tonight, for the first time, she considered letting it burn out. The darkness didn't seem as threatening anymore. Still, habits died hard, and the small flame was its own comfort. "Please, let me sleep," she whispered. But the words had lost their desperate edge. Now they sounded more like a gentle reminder, a bedtime ritual that connected her to all the nights before and all the nights to come. Through the wall, she heard Jonas settling for the night. Two souls in separate rooms, carrying separate griefs, but no longer quite so alone. It wasn't the life either of them had planned, but it was life, and that was more than either had dared hope for in their darkest moments. The lamp flickered, casting familiar shadows. Outside, wind rustled through cottonwood leaves, and Clara May Ellison fell asleep thinking about blue curtains and small kindnesses and the unexpected shelter of a house that had learned to hold two broken hearts instead of just one. The storm came without warning, turning the evening sky green-black and setting the horses to nervous stamping in their stalls. Clara had just finished clearing supper when the first crack of thunder shook the house. The lamp flames danced wildly, and somewhere upstairs, a shutter banged against its frame. Jonas rose from his chair, moving to secure the windows. "Going to be a bad one," he said. "Best check your room. That northwest window tends to leak when the wind drives rain." Clara nodded and climbed the stairs. In her room, she found the window already weeping small streams down the wall. She grabbed towels, pressing them against the sill, when another thunderclap struck so close the whole house trembled. She couldn't help the small cry that escaped her lips. "Clara," Jonas's voice came from the hallway. "You all right?" "Fine," she called back, though her hands shook as she adjusted the towels. "Just startled." The rain came then. Not drops, but sheets of water hammering the roof like fists. Lightning turned the world white-blue-white in rapid succession. Clara abandoned the window and sat on her bed, arms wrapped around her knees. She'd weathered storms before, but never one that felt so intent on tearing the world apart. A soft knock on her door. "The parlor might be safer," Jonas said through the wood. "Sometimes these storms spawn twisters." Clara opened the door to find him holding a lamp, his face etched with concern. "I don't want to impose—" "Not imposing, just sense." He turned toward the stairs. "I'll make coffee." She followed him down to find he'd already moved cushions and blankets near the centermost wall, away from windows. The thoughtfulness of it made her throat tight. He disappeared into the kitchen while she settled onto the makeshift pallet. The storm raged harder. Wind howled through every crack and crevice, and the house groaned like a ship at sea. Jonas returned with 2 cups and his own blanket, sitting a careful distance away. "Sarah hated storms," he said quietly. "Would hide in the root cellar if I let her. But not you. Grew up with them. Pa used to say storms were just God rearranging the furniture." A ghost of a smile. "Course, Pa also rebuilt our barn twice, so maybe God didn't care for his arrangements." Clara cupped the coffee, grateful for its warmth. "My husband loved storms. Would stand on the porch watching until I dragged him inside." The words surprised her. She rarely mentioned Samuel, even in her own thoughts. "How long were you married?" 6 years. She sipped the coffee, remembering. He was a good man, gentle, maybe too gentle for frontier life. Jonas didn't press, but something in his quiet attention invited more. "He took ill last winter. Lung fever. Doctor said he needed dry climate, rest, medicine we couldn't afford." Clara stared into her cup. "I took in washing, mending, anything to earn money. But it wasn't enough. Never enough." "Clara, he died thinking he'd failed me, failed our future children, kept apologizing with every ragged breath." Her voice stayed steady, but tears tracked down her cheeks. "I told him the only failure would be leaving me, but he left anyway." The storm crashed around them. Jonas shifted closer, not touching but near enough she could feel his warmth. After the funeral, I found out he'd borrowed money from the kind of men who don't accept widowhood as excuse for non-payment. Clara wiped her face with her sleeve. So I ran, took what little we had and ran west, a coward's choice. Survivor's choice. Jonas corrected firmly. Nothing cowardly about choosing to live. They sat quietly while thunder rolled overhead. Finally, Jonas spoke again. Sarah went into labor during a storm like this. 2 months early, I couldn't get to town for the doctor roads were washed out. His hands clenched around his cup. Did what I could, but I'm no midwife. She bled, and all I could do was hold her while she slipped away. Clara's hand moved without thought, covering his briefly before retreating. I'm sorry. The baby lived 3 hours. Never even opened her eyes. I wrapped her in Sarah's wedding quilt and buried them together when the storm passed. His voice was flat, factual, like reading a shopping list. Whole thing took less than a day. 20 years building a life, less than a day to lose it all. Jonas! After people kept saying it was God's will, God's plan, like that was supposed to comfort me. Bitterness crept into his tone. What kind of plan requires that much blood, that much pain? I don't know. Clara pulled her blanket tighter. I don't think anyone does. Tom Morrison said I should remarry quick. Said a man needs a woman's touch, especially in grief. Jonas laughed, sharp and humorless. Like Sarah was just a role to be filled, like any woman would do. Is that why you let me stay? The question slipped out before Clara could stop it. Jonas turned to look at her fully. In the lamplight, she could see every line etched by sorrow, every shadow cast by sleepless nights. I let you stay because you didn't look at me like something broken that needed fixing. First person in 3 years to just let me be. He paused. Why did you stay? Because you kept the lamp burning. Clara's voice came out whisper soft. Even that first night, when you didn't know me from Adam, you made sure there was light. The storm was moving off now. Thunder grumbling in the distance, but neither of them moved to return upstairs. The parlor felt like a haven, a place where hard truths could be spoken without judgment. I dream about her, Jonas said suddenly. Not good dreams. She's always bleeding, always asking why I couldn't save her. Sometimes the baby's crying, but I can never find her. I dream Samuel's still sick, Clara admitted. That I'm trying to give him medicine, but my hands won't work right, or the bottle's empty, or I'm moving too slow. I wake up exhausted from failing him all over again. Does it get easier? I don't know. Different. Maybe the dreams come less often. Clara pulled her knees to her chest. Sometimes I go whole days without feeling like I'm drowning. That seems like progress. Jonas made a sound that might have been agreement. They sat in companionable silence while the storm spent itself against the prairie. Finally, when the rain softened to patter and the wind dropped to whispers, he stirred. You should try to sleep. Dawn comes early. Clara nodded, but didn't move. Jonas, thank you for telling me. Thank you for listening. He gathered his blanket, started for the stairs, then paused. Clara, you're not any woman, just so you know. Before she could respond, he was gone, taking the lamp with him. Clara sat in the darkness, listening to his footsteps overhead. Her face was wet again, but these tears felt different, cleaner somehow, like the rain washing dust from windows. She made her way upstairs by touch and moonlight. Her room was cold, the leaked rain leaving puddles despite the towels. But her bed was dry, and when she lit her lamp, the flame seemed steadier than before. Through the wall, she could hear Jonas moving restlessly, without overthinking. She knocked softly on the shared wall. The movement stopped. Sleep well, Jonas, she said, just loud enough to carry. A pause, then, you too, Clara. She prepared for bed, hanging her damp clothes to dry. The storm had passed but left change in its wake. They'd crossed some invisible boundary tonight. Moved from careful strangers to something harder to name. Not romance, both too raw for that. But connection, understanding, the recognition of one wounded soul by another. Clara lay down, pulled quilts to her chin. "Please let me sleep," she whispered. But tonight, she added, "and let him sleep too. Let us both have peace, just for a few hours." The lamp burned low, casting familiar shadows. Outside, water dripped from eaves in steady rhythm, and somewhere in the darkness between midnight and dawn, two people who'd forgotten how to hope found themselves sleeping soundly in the same house, no longer quite so alone with their ghosts. Morning would bring awkwardness, probably. Careful distance reinstated, boundaries redrawn. But for now, in the clean-washed quiet after storm, they could rest, they could heal, inch by careful inch. They could learn that sharing sorrow didn't double it sometimes. It carved out space for something else to grow. The lamp flickered but didn't go out. And in his room, Jonas slept without dreams for the first time in 3 years. The change came gradually, like spring thaw after hard winter. Jonas stopped flinching when Clara hummed in the kitchen. Clara stopped jumping when Jonas entered a room without warning. They moved around each other with growing ease. Two people learning to share space without collision. It was a Tuesday evening when Jonas first heard a soft, rhythmic sound from Clara's room that wasn't crying or restless pacing. He paused in the hallway, listening. She was snoring. Gentle, barely audible, but unmistakably the sound of deep, untroubled sleep. He smiled despite himself and continued to his room. Through the wall, the soft snoring continued, and Jonas found it oddly comforting. Proof of life, of rest, of something normal in a house that had forgotten normal. The next morning, Clara was up before dawn as usual, coffee percolating when Jonas came downstairs. But something was different. She moved with easier grace, and when she turned from the stove, he caught her mid-yawn. "Sorry," she said, covering her mouth. "Don't know what's gotten into me. Slept like the dead last night." Jonas poured his coffee, added the single spoon of sugar she'd started leaving beside his cup without being asked. "Good. You needed it." She glanced at him, curious. "Did I disturb you? I know I sometimes talk in my sleep." "You snored," he said simply. "Just a little. It was nice." Color rose in Clara's cheeks. "Oh, I'm sorry. Don't be." Jonas took his seat. "House has been too quiet too long. Good to hear someone sleeping peaceful for once." They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, but Jonas noticed Clara touching her coffee cup, her plate, the table edge small. Unconscious gestures of someone settling in, making space their own. When she rose to clear dishes, she moved like she belonged here, knowing without looking where everything lived. "I'm going to town today." Jonas said, "Need to pick up feed. Check on an order at the blacksmith's." Clara nodded, already planning dinner around his absence. Then he added, "Thought you might come along, if you want." She froze, dish towel in hand. "But what about people talking?" "Let them talk." Jonas stood, carried his plate to the wash basin. "You've been cooped up here for weeks. Fresh air would do you good. Besides, I could use help loading the feed sacks." Clara studied his face, searching for the catch, finding none. She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "I'd like that. Let me change into my better dress." "It's just town. Clara, not Sunday service." But she was already heading upstairs, and Jonas heard her humming as she went. He shook his head but found himself straightening his own collar, running fingers through hair that needed cutting. They rode to town in companionable quiet. Clara wrapped in Sarah's good shawl against the morning chill. Jonas had expected stares, whispers, the weight of judgment, and those came. Sure enough, Mrs. Hartley turning away with a sniff, Tom Morrison scowling from his shop door. But other reactions surprised him. Old Mr. Chen at the general store nodded politely to Clara. even smiled when she asked after his health. The widow Patterson waved from her garden, and young Billy Turner called out, "Morning, Mr. Jonas, morning, Miss Clara," before his mother shushed him. At the feed store, Clara proved her worth, helping Jonas load heavy sacks with surprising strength. She calculated prices in her head faster than the clerk could figure on paper, catching an error that would have cost Jonas $2. "Smart woman you got there," the clerk said, correcting his figures. Jonas started to correct him. She wasn't his woman, but Clara spoke first. "Mr. Reed's been kind enough to employ me. I try to earn my keep." The clerk nodded, no judgment in his face. "Well, he's lucky to have the help. Place needs a woman's touch, if you don't mind my saying." Outside, loading the last sacks, Jonas caught Clara smiling to herself. "What?" "Just nice to be useful in daylight," she said, "to be seen as more than scandal or charity case." Jonas secured the load, then surprised them both by offering his hand to help her onto the wagon seat. Her fingers were warm through worn gloves, calloused from work but gentle in their grip. "One more stop," he said, guiding the horses toward the mercantile. "But we have everything on the list." "My list? You haven't made one." Inside the mercantile, Jonas watched Clara move between shelves with wonder barely contained. She touched bolts of fabric, tested thread between her fingers, examined buttons and ribbons like treasures. But she selected nothing, always returning items to their places. "Clara." She looked up from a display of hair combs. "Yes?" "Pick something." "I don't need—" "Not about need." Jonas pulled out his wallet. "You've been mending clothes with thread near invisible, cooking with spices so old they've lost flavor. Pick what you want to make the work easier, or prettier, whatever strikes your fancy." She hesitated, pride warring with practicality. Finally, she selected thread in various colors, new needles, a small tin of good tea, and after long deliberation, a single hair comb decorated with tiny blue flowers. "That all?" Jonas asked. "More than enough." She clutched her selections like prizes. He added a sack of white sugar, new dish towels, and a cake of the rose-scented soap she'd admired but not touched. At the counter, while Clara wasn't looking, he quietly pointed to a length of soft gray wool, perfect for a winter dress. The clerk nodded, understanding, and wrapped it separately. The ride home was different. Clara sat straighter, head high despite the whispers that followed their passage. She'd claimed her place in town not as Jonas's secret shame, but as his respectable housekeeper. It shouldn't have mattered so much, but it did. Back home, Clara immediately set water to heat for tea, using her new tin with reverence. Jonas unloaded supplies, tucking the wrapped wool fabric behind the flour sacks. He'd find the right moment to give it to her, when it wouldn't seem like charity or obligation. That evening, after supper, Clara didn't immediately retreat to her room. Instead, she sat by the fire with her mending, new thread making neat work of torn seams. Jonas read his paper, occasionally glancing at her over the pages. The hair comb caught lamplight in her carefully pinned hair. "Thank you," she said suddenly, "for today, for treating me like a person." "You are a person, Clara, always have been. You know what I mean." She focused on her stitching. "It's been a long time since anyone looked at me and saw something other than widow or burden or fallen woman." Jonas set down his paper. "Is that what you think you are, fallen?" "Aren't I?" Her voice stayed steady, but her hands stilled. "Living in a man's house, taking his charity—" "Taking wages for honest work," Jonas corrected firmly. "Nothing fallen about that. Nothing shameful about surviving." Clara looked up then, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Sometimes I forget that. Sometimes the voices in town get louder than the truth." "Then we'll have to make the truth louder." Jonas picked up his paper again. "Matter of fact. Starting with proper curtains for this parlor, that blue fabric's been sitting there for days. She laughed, actually laughed, and the sound filled the room like spring water. I suppose it has. I'll start them tomorrow. Good. They settled back into quiet, but it was different now. Fuller. Clara's needle flashed in the lamplight. Jonas's paper rustled with each turned page. The fire popped and settled, and underneath it all, barely audible but absolutely there, the sound of Clara humming. Jonas closed his eyes, let the melody wash over him. He didn't recognize the tune, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the sound of contentment in his house again, the presence of someone who'd learned to rest easy in her skin. When the clock struck 9, Clara folded her mending. I'll bank the kitchen fire. I'll get this one. They moved through their nighttime routines with practiced ease. Clara paused at the foot of the stairs. Jonas, I'm glad you made me come today. I'm glad you came. She climbed the stairs, humming again. Jonas finished with the fire and followed, stopping at his door to listen. Her room was quiet. No restless pacing, no whispered pleas for sleep, just the soft sounds of someone preparing for bed without fear. He entered his own room, changed into nightclothes. Through the wall came a gentle knock. Sleep well, Jonas. You too, Clara. It had become their ritual, these quiet good nights through wood and plaster. Tonight, Jonas found himself smiling as he settled into bed. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, always did. But tonight, his house held peace. And from the other room, soft as summer rain, came the sound of Clara snoring. Jonas fell asleep to that gentle rhythm, and for the first time in memory, looked forward to morning. Not because the night was hard, but because the day held promise. Coffee shared in comfortable silence. Work that meant something. And maybe, if he was lucky, more of Clara's laughter filling up the empty spaces. The lamp in her room still glowed faintly. He could see the light under his door, but it seemed less like fear now and more like habit, a small comfort she allowed herself in a world that had offered few comforts. Jonas understood. He had his own rituals, his own ways of keeping the dark at bay. But tonight, with Clara sleeping peacefully just walls away, the darkness seemed less absolute, less permanent. Change came slowly to grieving hearts, but it came. Sure as spring followed winter, gentle as a woman snoring through thin walls, and that, Jonas thought as sleep claimed him, was miracle enough for any man. Sunday morning arrived crisp and bright. Clara stood in the kitchen, watching Jonas adjust his collar for the 3rd time. He'd announced at breakfast his intention to attend church first time in 3 years and asked if she'd accompany him. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. Not for my sake. Not doing it for you. He gave up on the collar. Let it lie crooked. Maybe it's time, is all. Clara smoothed her gray dress, the one she'd worn to Samuel's funeral. It was her best, though the hem showed wear and the sleeves had been turned twice. She'd pinned her hair carefully, using the new comb with blue flowers. We don't have to sit together, she offered, if that would make it easier. Jonas looked at her then, really looked, saw the careful courage in her straight shoulders, the acceptance in her eyes. She'd grown used to being separated, set apart, made less than... We'll sit together, he said firmly. Let them make of it what they will. The walk to church took 20 minutes on foot. Jonas had offered to hitch the wagon, but Clara said the fresh air would do them good. Truth was, she needed the time to steady her nerves. They passed other families making their way to worship. Some nodded greeting, others looked away. Children stared openly until mothers pulled them close. Clara kept her eyes forward, matching Jonas's steady pace. The church steps loomed before them. People clustered in conversation, but silence fell as Jonas and Clara approached. She felt the weight of every gaze, heard the whispers start before they'd even reached the doors. Mr. Reed. Reverend Philip stood at the entrance, surprise clear on his face. We've missed you. Reverend. Jonas touched his hat brim. This is Mrs. Ellison, my housekeeper. Ma'am. The Reverend's greeting was polite but cool. Welcome to God's house. Inside, Jonas led them to his old pew, third row from the back, left side. Clara saw people turn to watch, saw Mrs. Hartley's face pinch with disapproval, saw Tom Morrison lean over to mutter in his wife's ear. But she also saw the widow Patterson smile and pat the pew beside her in invitation. Saw young Dr. Walsh tip his hat, saw the schoolteacher, Miss Catherine Perry, give a small wave. Jonas sat first, then Clara. Careful space between them. Not too close to invite scandal, not too far to seem ashamed. The pew felt strange after 3 years empty, too full and too vacant at the same time. Sarah liked the aisle seat, Jonas murmured. Said she could see the flowers better. Clara said nothing, but shifted slightly toward the middle, giving him room for memory. The service began. Hymns Clara half remembered from childhood, prayers that felt both foreign and familiar on her tongue. When Reverend Phillips began his sermon about forgiveness and redemption, she felt Jonas tense beside her. Brothers and sisters, the Reverend intoned, we must remember that God's house welcomes all who seek him, the widow and orphan, the stranger and sojourner. But we must also guard against wolves among the sheep, those who would use God's mercy as license for impropriety. Clara's face burned. Beside her, Jonas's jaw worked like he was chewing nails. However, the Reverend continued, his gaze sweeping the congregation, we must also remember Christ's words, judge not, lest ye be judged. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. We are all sinners, all fallen, all in need of grace. The sermon continued, but Clara heard little of it. She was too aware of Jonas beside her, rigid with controlled anger, of the eyes boring into their backs, of the whispers that would follow them home. When the final hymn began, Jonas stood abruptly. Clara followed, and they made their way out before the last verse ended. Better to leave than to face the gauntlet of after-service socializing. Outside, Jonas strode away from the church so fast Clara had to half-run to keep pace. He didn't speak until they were well out of earshot. That was a mistake, he said flatly. I shouldn't have put you through that. You didn't put me through anything. Clara touched his arm, stopping him. I chose to go. To be preached at, to be held up as example of what not to do. His voice cracked with fury. 3 years I stayed away, and first Sunday back, he uses us for a moral lesson. He also preached forgiveness. After making sure everyone knew we needed forgiving, Jonas pulled off his hat, ran fingers through his hair. This is why I stopped going. Sarah dying wasn't enough. They had to make it mean something. Had to find the lesson, the purpose, the damn silver lining. Clara stood quietly, letting him rage. She understood. Sometimes anger was cleaner than grief. And now they'll add you to their gossip, he continued. The widow woman living in sin with the grieving widower. We'll be their cautionary tale for months. Jonas, she waited until he looked at her. Do you want me to leave, find other lodgings I could take that position at the church? No. The word came fierce and immediate. Don't let them chase you off. Not on my account. Then stop letting them chase you off on mine. He blinked, surprised by her firmness. Clara straightened her shoulders. You wanted to go to church today. First time in 3 years. You were ready. Don't let their small minds take that from you. She adjusted her shawl. Besides, not everyone was hostile. I saw kindness, too. Jonas looked skeptical. Where? The widow Patterson, Dr. Walsh, Miss Perry. Others who remember their own struggles. Clara smiled slightly. The congregation's not monolithic, just loud in certain quarters. They resumed walking. Slower now. The sun climbed higher, warming the day. Other families passed, returning from service. Some acknowledged them, some didn't. Clara found she cared less than expected. "I used to love Sundays." Jonas said suddenly. "Sarah would make special breakfast. We'd walk to church, sit in our pew, pretend we understood whatever Reverend Phillips was going on about. Then home for roast dinner and lazy afternoon reading." "You could have that again, parts of it." "It's not the same." "No," Clara agreed. "Nothing's ever the same, but different doesn't mean worthless." They reached the house, sanctuary after the morning's trial. Jonas held the door for her, a gesture that had become natural between them. Inside, Clara went immediately to the kitchen. "I'll start dinner." "Clara, wait." Jonas stood in the doorway, hat in hands. "Thank you for coming with me, for understanding." "You're welcome." She tied on her apron. "Now go change out of your good clothes. No sense wearing them to table." He went, and Clara busied herself with the roast she'd prepared before dawn. Simple Sunday dinner, nothing fancy. But as she worked, she found herself humming hymns from the service. Not all memories from church were bad. Some were about community, belonging, shared faith in something larger than individual sorrow. Jonas returned in work clothes, looking more himself. He set the table without being asked, another small evolution in their domestic dance. When Clara brought the food, he held her chair before sitting himself. They ate in companionable quiet, but it felt different from their usual careful silence. Fuller, like they'd passed some test together, faced the world's judgment and found it survivable. "Next Sunday," Jonas said suddenly. "We could go again, if you want." Clara looked up, surprised. "After today?" "Maybe especially after today." He cut into his roast with deliberation. "I'm tired of letting them win, tired of hiding like I've done something shameful by surviving." "It won't get easier." The whispers. "No, but maybe that's not the point." Jonas met her gaze. "Maybe the point is showing up anyway, taking our place, refusing to be erased." Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest. Not romance, but partnership, alliance, two people choosing to face the world together rather than alone. "All right," she said, "next Sunday." They finished dinner, cleared dishes, settled into afternoon routines. Jonas with his newspaper, Clara with the mending that never seemed to end. But the quality of quiet had changed again. No longer hiding, but resting. No longer separate, but together. As evening approached, Clara made tea with her good tin, served it in the parlor. Another small breach of protocol. Servants didn't take tea with employers, but they'd moved beyond such simple categories. "I've been thinking," Jonas said, staring into his cup, "about what you said. Different not meaning worthless." Clara waited, recognizing the careful way he approached difficult topics. "Sarah's garden," he continued. "It's gone to seed, 3 years of neglect, but the fence is still good, soil's still rich. Come spring, we could plant again." Clara finished softly. "New seeds, different flowers maybe, but flowers all the same." "Yes." Jonas looked at her then, something shifting in his expression. "Would you help, I mean, if you're still here, still willing?" "I'll be here," Clara said simply. "And yes, I'll help." They drank their tea as shadows lengthened across the floor. Tomorrow would bring its challenges: town gossip, daily work, the constant navigation of propriety and need. But tonight, they'd claimed something. Not love, not yet, but possibility. The lamp burned in Clara's room that night, as always. But Jonas, lying in his bed, noticed it seemed dimmer than before. Progress, perhaps, or maybe just the conservation of oil. Either way, it felt like hope. "Sleep well, Clara," he called through the wall. "You too, Jonas, and thank you for today." He smiled in the darkness. 3 years of Sundays had passed in isolation, But next week, he'd walk into church again, Clara beside him. Let them whisper. Let them judge. He'd spent enough time in exile. Some things were worth the cost of scandal. Companionship, purpose, the slow return to something resembling life. And if that life looked different from what he'd imagined, well, Clara was right. Different didn't mean worthless. The house settled around them, holding two hearts learning to beat in rhythm. Not the same tune they'd known before, but music nonetheless. And that, Jonas thought as sleep took him, was resurrection enough for anyone. Spring arrived quietly, melting the last stubborn patches of snow and coaxing green shoots from the earth. Clara stood in what had been Sarah's garden, surveying 3 years of neglect, weeds tangled with the remnants of perennial flowers, fighting for space in the rich soil. It's salvageable, she said, more to herself than to Jonas, who leaned against the fence watching her. Needs work, but the bones are good. Sarah planted those roses, he said, pointing to a corner where wild growth nearly obscured once cultivated bushes. Said every garden needed something that bloomed despite neglect. Clara smiled. Wise woman. They'd fallen into easy rhythm over the winter months. Coffee at dawn. Work through the day. Quiet evenings by the fire. The town had gradually accepted their arrangement, or at least grown bored with gossiping about it. Even Mrs. Hartley managed a tight nod when they passed on the street. I'll need seeds, Clara said, already planning. Vegetables for sure, but flowers too. A garden should feed the soul as well as the body. Jonas pushed off from the fence. Make a list. We'll go to town tomorrow. But Clara wasn't listening anymore. She'd discovered something beneath a tangle of dead vines, a small wooden marker. Painted letters faded but still readable. Baby read 3 hours of heaven, of. Jonas saw her freeze, saw what she'd found. He hadn't visited this corner of the garden since the burial. Couldn't bear to. I'm sorry, Clara whispered. I didn't mean to. It's all right. His voice came rough. She should be remembered. Clara carefully cleared the weeds around the marker, her movements gentle as if the ground itself might bruise. When she finished, the small grave stood revealed a tiny patch of earth that held enormous grief. We could plant forget-me-nots here, she suggested softly. They'll spread each year, make a blue carpet, beautiful but hardy. Jonas nodded, not trusting his voice. Clara stood, dusting soil from her skirt, and he saw her discreetly wipe her eyes. They worked the rest of the morning in companionable silence, clearing weeds, turning soil. By noon, the garden's outline emerged from chaos beds waiting to be planted, paths ready to be restored. Lunch, Clara suggested, and Jonas realized they'd both skipped breakfast in their eagerness to start. In the kitchen, she moved with practiced efficiency while he washed at the pump. This too had become routine shared meals that weren't quite employer and employee, weren't quite anything else they could name. I've been thinking, Clara said, serving soup and fresh bread. About that sign Tom Morrison mentioned, for my seamstress work. Jonas paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. They'd discussed her taking in mending from townsfolk, earning extra money, but a sign made it official, public, permanent. What about it? I could have one made, hang it by the front gate. She met his eyes steadily. If you're agreeable. It's your business, your decision. It's your house, your reputation. Jonas set down his spoon. Clara, when are you going to understand my reputation was gone the day Sarah died? Everything since has been rebuilding. Different than before, but rebuilding nonetheless. He gestured around the kitchen she'd made warm and welcoming. You're part of that, the sign, the business. It's all part of moving forward. Clara's eyes shimmered. Thank you. Besides, Jonas added, returning to his soup. Half the women in town already bring you their mending. Might as well make it official. That afternoon, while Jonas repaired the garden fence, Clara worked in the parlor. transforming the blue fabric into curtains that caught light like summer sky. The house had slowly filled with such touches cushions she'd sewn, rugs she'd beaten back to brightness, windows that sparkled. But more than physical changes, the house felt alive again, inhabited, the kind of place that might welcome visitors, host gatherings, become part of the community's fabric once more. A knock at the door interrupted her stitching. Clara found young Dr. Walsh on the porch, hat in hand. "Mrs. Ellison, is Mr. Reed about?" "In the garden. Shall I fetch him?" "Actually, I was hoping to speak with both of you." The doctor shifted nervously. "May I come in?" Clara led him to the parlor, called Jonas from the garden. The two men shook hands, and they all sat, Clara automatically taking what had become her chair by the window. "I'll come straight to it. Doctor," Walsh said, "I'm getting married come June. Elizabeth Murray, you might know her father owns the bank." Jonas nodded. Clara murmured congratulations. "Thing is," the doctor continued, "we'll need help. Housekeeper, cook, someone to help when children come along. Elizabeth suggested that is, we wondered." He looked between them. "Would you consider it, Mrs. Ellison? Good wages, room of your own, respectable position." The parlor fell silent. Clara felt Jonas tense beside her, though his expression remained neutral. "That's kind of you to offer," Clara said carefully. "When would you need an answer?" "Oh, not for weeks yet. Just wanted to plant the seed, so to speak." Dr. Walsh stood. "Think it over. No pressure. Just options." After he left, Clara and Jonas sat in loaded silence. Finally, she spoke. "It would be a good position, respectable, with a young couple, fresh start." "Yes," Jonas's voice was flat. "It would." "Jonas." "It's a good offer." He stood abruptly. "You should consider it." He left before she could respond. Clara heard the back door slam, saw him striding toward the barn. She returned to her curtains, but her hands shook too much for straight seams. Dinner was stilted, both of them careful and polite, the easy rhythm of months shattered by possibility of change. Clara cleared plates while Jonas built up the fire, though the evening was mild. "I haven't decided anything," she said finally. "Nothing to decide. It's a better position than here." "Is it?" Clara turned from the wash basin. "Is it really?" Jonas looked up from the fire. In the flickering light, she could see uncertainty in his eyes, a question he couldn't quite voice. "I have work here," Clara continued. "A routine, a home. You could have those things with the Walshes, without the talk, without the impropriety. What if I don't care about propriety anymore?" The words hung between them. Jonas stood slowly, crossed to where she stood by the sink. "Clara." "I'm tired of running," she interrupted. "Tired of starting over. This place, this life we've built, it's not what I expected, but it's good. It's real. Why would I leave that for something that might be easier but would definitely be less?" Jonas reached past her for a dish towel, their arms brushing. Neither pulled away. "People would understand if you took the position," he said quietly. "No one would blame you." "Would you?" He met her eyes then. "No, but I'd miss you, miss this." He gestured vaguely at the kitchen, the house, the life they'd assembled from broken pieces. "I've gotten used to not being alone." Clara smiled through tears. "So have I." Without thinking, she reached up and straightened his collar, a wifely gesture that made them both freeze. But Jonas didn't pull back. Instead, he covered her hand with his, held it against his chest where she could feel his heart racing. "Stay," he said simply. "Please." "Yes." The words settled between them like a vow. Not marriage, not yet, but commitment nonetheless. A choice to stop running, stop hiding, stop apologizing for finding comfort in unexpected places. Jonas squeezed her hand, then stepped back. The boundaries remained, but softer now, permeable. "We should write to Dr. Walsh," Clara said, voice steady again. "Thank him for the offer, but decline." It seems like an us decision, don't you think?" Jonas smiled a real smile that transformed his face. "I suppose it does." They finished cleaning the kitchen together, moving in practiced harmony. Tomorrow, Clara would hang her sign, "Laundry and Needlework by Clara Ellison, Inquire Within." Jonas had already added, in his careful script, a line at the bottom, "Lantern stays low. Lady sleeps fine now." It had started as a promise of safety, a reassurance to a frightened stranger. Now it was simply truth. The lamp in Clara's room barely flickered these days, and some nights she forgot to light it at all. The darkness had lost its power when she'd found someone willing to share it. As they prepared for bed, Jonas paused at Clara's door. "About the garden tomorrow?" "Forget-me-nots for the baby's grave," Clara confirmed. "And vegetables for us, flowers for beauty. A proper garden again. Different from before, but still beautiful." They said their goodnights through the wall, as always, but tonight the words carried new weight. Not just routine, but affirmation. We're still here. We're staying. We're choosing this life we've built from sorrow and stubbornness and slowly blooming hope. Clara didn't light her lamp at all that night. The darkness held no terrors now, just rest and peace, and the quiet breathing of a house that had remembered how to be a home. And in the morning, there would be coffee and conversation and the solid presence of someone who understood that love came in many forms, sometimes passionate, sometimes quiet, always a choice to keep showing up despite the odds. The widow and the widower had found something neither expected, not a replacement for what was lost, but a new chapter entirely, written in shared silence and small kindnesses, in cups of coffee and mended clothes and the simple miracle of sleeping soundly, knowing someone who cared kept watch just rooms away. Different from what they'd known before, but no less precious for being unexpected. The night settled softly around the house, around two hearts that had learned to beat in companionate rhythm, and in the garden, beneath cleared earth and careful hands, new seeds waited for morning to begin their own unlikely resurrection. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and exchange thoughts about Clara and Jonas's journey. If you enjoyed this tale from the Old West, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and hit the like button. And don't forget to press the hype button to help this story reach more listeners who appreciate authentic frontier tales. Until next time, partners.